The atmosphere of the high desert was a frozen shroud, pressing down upon a solitary traveler huddled beside the flickering remnants of a dying blaze. The silence of the wasteland was absolute, until a fragile, quivering voice drifted from the ink-black shadows, a soft plea that cut through the chill. "Would you permit me to find a moment's warmth beside your hearth?" That simple inquiry, whispered in the dead of night, was the catalyst for a journey that would fundamentally reshape the destinies of two wandering souls. On that particular evening, the wind didn't just blow, it descended upon the open plains like a weary, wandering spectre. It moved with a ghostly exhaustion, dragging a heavy veil of grit and silence across the desolate landscape. Near a solitary cluster of cottonwood trees that stood guard over the skeletal remains of Bitter Creek, a tiny spark of defiance fought against the encroaching gloom. The fire's orange light pulsed and shuddered, a fragile heartbeat in the middle of a vast, indifferent vacuum. Daniel Cross was the man at the center of that light. He sat with his spine pressed against the worn leather of his saddle, his wide-brimmed hat tilted forward to shield his eyes from the biting air. He was a man of the earth, weathered, lined, and hardened by more miles of trail than most people would dare to contemplate in a lifetime. Nearby, his horse moved with the slow, rhythmic grace of a creature accustomed to the long haul, grazing on the sparse scrub. Above them, the celestial canopy was a staggering display of brilliance, a tapestry of stars so dense and deep it felt like a narrative too grand for human language to contain. For weeks on end, Daniel had existed in a vacuum of solitude. He was currently occupied with the task of herding stray cattle toward the Northern Territories, working for a rancher who valued a man's silence as much as his skill and paid in cold, hard silver. In such a wilderness, a man developed an ear for the subtle shifts in the wind, learning to decipher the language of the brush better than the chatter of townspeople. It was this honed instinct that alerted him to her presence long before she became a silhouette. There was a sound, a rhythmic, hesitant crunch of leather soles against the parched grass. It was a careful, tentative approach, as if the traveler were terrified of offending the night itself. Daniel didn't draw the heavy revolver that lay resting against his thigh, but his fingers moved with a practiced, casual drift toward the grip. He watched the perimeter of the light. Suddenly, the shadows parted, and a figure stepped into the dim, amber radiance. She was young, perhaps no more than 25, though the weight she carried made her appear older. She was draped in a tattered shawl that might have once boasted a vibrant shade of azure, but time and the relentless dust of the trail had faded it to the color of the earth. Her hair was a tangled mane, framing a face that was strikingly pale and etched with the deep lines of total exhaustion. For several heartbeats, she remained motionless, her weary eyes reflecting the dancing spirits of the flames. When she finally found the strength to speak, her voice was so thin that it seemed the gale might carry it away before it reached his ears. "May I warm myself by your fire?" Daniel studied her with a steady, unblinking gaze. In the unforgiving reaches of the West, a stranger emerging from the midnight dark usually heralded one of two things: profound tragedy or imminent danger. Sometimes both. Yet, there was a quality in her tone, a raw, shattered sincerity, that no outlaw could ever hope to manufacture. After a moment of heavy silence, he gestured toward the burning wood with a slight tilt of his head. "The fire isn't my property," he rumbled, his voice like gravel. "It belongs to anyone who finds themselves in need of the heat." She moved toward the circle of light with a slow, painstaking caution, as if she feared the invitation might be rescinded if she moved too quickly. As she lowered herself to the ground beside the coals, her hands were visibly shaking, reaching out to grasp at the warmth. A long, profound silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic popping of the cedar and the moan of the prairie wind as it swept across the emptiness. Eventually, Daniel reached for a blackened tin cup and pushed it across the dirt toward her. "The coffee has sat too long and turned bitter, but it'll put some heat back in your marrow." She took the vessel with both hands, clutching it like a lifeline. "I am grateful to you, Mr. Daniel," she said, offering a small nod of appreciation. "Emily," she added, her voice carrying the soft, melodic lilt of the Deep South. The kind of accent born in quiet river towns where the church bells mark the passage of the day. Daniel took note of the thick crust of grime on her footwear and the insufficient thickness of her coat against the plummeting temperature. "You've covered a lot of ground on foot tonight, Emily. You've been walking since the sun went down. Where is it you're trying to get to?" Instead of meeting his gaze, she fixed her eyes on the glowing embers. Daniel had encountered that specific look many times before. He had seen it in the eyes of hollowed-out drifters, shell-shocked soldiers returning from war, and widows left with nothing but ash. It was the expression of a person whose past is a conflagration, making the road behind them far more dangerous than the uncertainty ahead. Finally, she answered, "I'm looking for any place where the shadows of yesterday can't find me." Daniel reached up and scratched the silver-flecked stubble on his jawline. "There aren't many sanctuaries like that left in these parts. This prairie has a long memory. It doesn't forget much of anything." Emily offered a faint, melancholic ghost of a smile. "I'm starting to realize that." Quietude reclaimed the camp for a time. The shifting firelight played across the deep-set lines of Daniel's face and cast flickering shadows over Emily's haunted features. Somewhere in the vast distance, a coyote let out a mournful cry, a lonely sound that echoed the isolation of the desert. "People don't usually traverse the plains in total solitude unless there's something breathing down their necks," Daniel said softly, his voice barely rising above the crackle of the wood. Emily's grip tightened around the tin cup until her knuckles turned white. "My husband passed away this previous winter." In a gesture of quiet reverence, Daniel touched the brim of his hat. "You have my sympathies." She returned her gaze to the fire, her voice hardening with the memory. "It wasn't a fever or a sickness that took him. It was men, predators who rode onto our land looking for wealth we didn't possess. My husband, he tried to speak reason to them. He thought they were men like any other." Daniel remained perfectly still, waiting for the rest of the story. Emily swallowed hard, her throat working against the lump of grief. "They torched the barn, drove off every head of horse we owned, and when he stood his ground to protect what was ours, they—" She trailed off, her breath hitching as she struggled for composure. Daniel didn't push her to fill the silence. He knew the shape of that particular silence all too well. After a jagged breath, she managed to continue. "The local sheriff made promises about tracking them down, but those promises turned to dust. He claimed there were too many marauding gangs for one man to handle. I had to dig the grave myself, right there under the cottonwood tree near the porch. I stayed long enough to say goodbye, and then I turned my back on that life before the spring thaw." Daniel continued to stare into the heart of the fire, but his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. The change in his demeanor didn't escape Emily's notice. "You've encountered men like that before, haven't you?" Daniel let out a long, weary sigh. "More times than a man should have to remember." She looked at him with a newfound curiosity, her eyes searching his weathered face. "You're more than just a hired hand moving cattle, aren't you?" Daniel gave a noncommittal shrug. "I once carried a tin star in a place called Red Hollow. I held that office for 6 years, right up until the day I realized that the wheels of the law often turn too slow to stop real evil." Emily's eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Then why did you walk away from it?" Daniel's voice dropped into a low, resonant register. "Because there's a limit to how many good, honest people a man can bury before he starts to fear the desert is going to swallow his soul along with theirs." Emily watched the flames for a long interval, the light flickering across her face as if it were illuminating the very memories she desperately wished would remain in the dark. Eventually, she spoke again, her voice tight with detail. "The men who murdered him, they wore crimson scarves over their faces to hide their identities. There were 5 of them in total. Their leader had a distinctive mark, a jagged scar that ran across his cheek like a bolt of lightning." Daniel's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, piercing intensity. "Do you happen to know the name he went by?" She gave a small, tremulous nod. Cole Maddox. For a moment, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air of the frontier recognized the name and recoiled from it. Daniel stared into the orange depths of the fire, but something fundamental had shifted in his posture. Cole Maddox was a phantom of the high plains, a butcher whose reputation was carved into the history of the territories in blood and fire. He left nothing behind but charred timber and fresh mounds of earth. Emily sensed the sudden, cold focus that had overtaken the cowboy. The name means something to you, doesn't it? I've crossed his trail once or twice, years ago, Daniel replied, his voice chillingly calm. A sudden, sharp spark of hope ignited in Emily's eyes, warring with the lingering pain. Then you know where he might be? You know where he's riding? Daniel shook his head slowly, the grim reality returning. Men like Maddox don't have a home. They don't linger long enough for the reach of justice to catch up to them. The hope in her eyes dimmed, and she looked back down at the dirt. I suppose I knew that was the truth. Daniel watched her for a few moments, the gears of his mind turning behind a stoic mask. Why are you sharing this with a stranger, Emily? She looked up, her eyes bright with a quiet, desperate plea. Because you have the look of a man who knows what it means to lose everything. And because sometimes, a stranger in the middle of nowhere has more room for mercy than the rest of the world combined. A large log snapped in the fire, sending a cascade of sparks drifting toward the heavens like a swarm of golden fireflies. Daniel leaned forward, placing a fresh branch onto the coals to keep the darkness at bay. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the immense weight of a man who had been carrying a secret for a very long time. You came into my camp and asked if you could share the warmth of my fire, he began. Emily nodded silently. Daniel looked her full in the face, his eyes revealing a depth of experience shaped by decades of grit, peril, and the heavy burden of regret. Emily, you aren't just sitting beside a lonely cowboy tonight. You're sitting beside the man who has spent the last 7 years of his life hunting for Cole Maddox. The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow, making the world feel as though it were spinning off its axis. Daniel continued in a steady, hushed tone. I have followed his scent across 3 different territories. I didn't do it for a bounty, and I didn't do it for a badge. I did it for the people like your husband. I did it for the widows who were left with nothing but a cold hearth and a silence that screams. I did it because someone had to. Emily's breath caught in her throat. You mean? You're going to find him? Daniel gave a single, firm nod. I fully intend to. The firelight danced across Emily's stunned features while the wind played a mournful tune through the cottonwood branches above. For the first time since she had emerged from the void of the desert, the night didn't feel quite so vast or quite so lonely. And leagues away, across the sleeping plains and past the ruined homesteads of the forgotten, a man named Cole Maddox moved beneath the same cold stars, entirely unaware that the scales of fate had just tipped against him. Beside that small, isolated fire near Bitter Creek, the night lingered long after Daniel had spoken. For a substantial amount of time, Emily remained silent, her mind racing. The fire eventually settled into a consistent, warm glow as the wind lost its edge, carrying the faint, earthy sense of sagebrush and cooling sand. She watched Daniel intently, trying to discern if hope was a luxury she could afford to feel again. For months, she had been a nomad of grief, her sorrow her only constant companion. Now, by sheer chance, she had stumbled upon the one man who was pursuing the source of her nightmare. Finally, she broke the silence. 7 years. You've really been on his trail that long? Daniel nodded as he tended to the blaze. I have. Emily studied the map of his face, the deep lines etched by the sun and the quiet, iron-willed patience in his gaze. But why? Why dedicate your life to it? Daniel leaned back against his saddle, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the blackness of the plains met the sky. Because the law turned its back on the pursuit a long time ago. People started talking like Maddox was an act of nature, something the desert would eventually reclaim on its own. But I couldn't stop seeing the faces of those he ruined. I saw the women standing in empty doorways, staring at nothing. I saw children who would never know their fathers' voices. I saw the ash heaps where homes used to be. Eventually, I realized that someone had to keep the trail hot, even when the authorities stopped caring. Emily looked down at her hands, the memories of her own home's destruction flickering like a painful film behind her eyes. Daniel's voice softened with empathy. I'm not telling you this to rip open your wounds, Emily. I'm just giving you the truth of things. She pulled her shawl tighter against the chill, her hands finally beginning to steady. I don't actually want the pain to go away, she whispered. It's the only part of him I still get to keep. Daniel nodded slowly, he understood that brand of sorrow. On the frontier, you learned early that loss doesn't fade, it just becomes a permanent part of your shadow, riding beside you through every mile of the journey. They sat in companionable silence for a long while, the fire the only barrier between them and the infinite prairie. Eventually, Daniel stood up to check the horse and scan the dark perimeter, a habit born of a lifetime of vigilance. Emily watched him move. He possessed the economical, fluid grace of a man who had survived 100 dangerous places. When he returned to the light, he offered her a strip of dried venison from his stores. It's humble fare, but it'll give you the strength you need for tomorrow. Thank you, Daniel, she said softly. You didn't have to share any of this. Not the fire, and certainly not your food. Daniel sat back down, his movements heavy but deliberate. A man alone out here learns the worth of a little kindness pretty quick. It's the only thing that keeps the desert from turning you into stone. Emily looked out toward the hills, where the first faint silver of the moon began to touch the crests of the dunes. What happens when you finally catch up to him? Daniel's response was immediate and level. Then the running ends. Not necessarily with a spectacle of lead and blood, but simply because the road has reached its natural conclusion. She looked at him, puzzled. You don't sound like a man who is consumed by a need for vengeance. Daniel took a moment to frame his answer. Vengeance is a fire that leaves a man hollow if he lets it burn too long in his gut. I'm looking for something a bit more durable than that. Emily tilted her head. Justice? Daniel nodded once. The word seemed to hang in the air, weighted with a sense of sacred duty. For the first time since she had buried her husband, Emily felt a small, determined spark ignite within her soul. The horizon no longer looked like an endless, empty grave. She looked back at Daniel, her fear being eclipsed by a burgeoning courage. Then I want to go with you. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. Emily, I can't allow that. No. I am completely serious, she insisted, her voice gaining strength. I've spent the last few months trying to outrun my past. I think it's time I stopped running and started facing it. Daniel shook his head firmly. Tracking a predator like Cole Maddox isn't a trip for someone who is still carrying a fresh burden of grief. It's too dangerous, Emily. Her eyes flashed with a sudden, iron-willed intensity he hadn't seen before. That grief is exactly why I have to be there. I won't be a victim of it anymore. Daniel studied her for a long minute. He saw no flicker of doubt in her eyes, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. Finally, he let out a long, defeated breath. The sun will be up in a few hours. We'll make our way to a settlement called Silver Ridge. There's a man there, a preacher named Caleb Turner, who owes me a debt from years ago. He'll make sure you have a secure place to stay and a way to start over. Emily's posture slumped slightly, her disappointment clear. So that's your plan? You just drop me off and ride away into the sunset alone? Daniel's gaze was gentle but firm. I'm trying to keep you breathing, Emily. That's the priority. Emily stared into the embers for a long time. Then, she spoke with a quiet, devastating certainty. When my husband died, I made a vow to him while I was piling the dirt on his grave. I promised him, and myself, that I would not spend the rest of my days hiding from the shadows of the men who broke our world. The wind gusted across the camp, but Daniel remained silent, listening. If you ride out without me, she continued, I will simply find the trail on my own. I may not have your skills as a tracker, but don't underestimate what a woman's grief can teach her about persistence. Daniel rubbed his chin, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had encountered that brand of stubborn bravery before, it was usually found in the quietest souls. He gave a soft, dry chuckle. You remind me of someone I used to know. Who? She asked. My sister, Daniel replied, his eyes softening. She managed a ranch better than any 3 men I ever met, and she could intimidate half the cowpokes in the territory with a single look. Emily smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired face. She sounds like a woman worth knowing. She was, Daniel said. The use of the past tense wasn't lost on Emily, but she chose not to pry. This land was already populated by enough ghosts. As the fire began to fade into gray ash, the eastern sky started to bleed into a pale, translucent violet. The arrival of a new day was beginning its slow march across the frontier. Daniel pushed himself to his feet, stretching his cramped muscles. All right, Emily. You've won this argument. She looked up, a glimmer of hope returning. Truly? For now, he cautioned. But you need to understand something. The path we're taking isn't going to be easy or kind. Maddox surrounds himself with the worst kind of men, and the closer we get to the end of that trail, the darker the world is going to get. Emily rose to her feet, her movements filled with a quiet, newfound purpose. My life has been nothing but darkness since last winter, Daniel. At least now, that darkness has a destination. Daniel watched her for a final moment before giving a decisive nod. Then we ride out together. He set about saddling his horse as the sky transitioned from midnight to a deep, royal blue. Once the gear was secure, he handed Emily a folded saddle blanket and assisted her in mounting behind him. The vast expanse of the prairie lay before them, just as the first golden sliver of the sun broke over the edge of the world. Emily looked back one last time at the smoldering remains of the fire where their paths had collided. Then, she turned her face toward the horizon. Daniel nudged the horse forward. As they moved across the open territory, the wind seemed to carry a whispered promise that the story beginning here was far larger than a simple hunt for an outlaw. Somewhere beyond the rising hills, they would encounter a rancher with fresh news of a gang wearing red scarves. In a sun-bleached town, a lawman would mention the name Cole Maddox with a tremor of dread. And far ahead on a winding, lonely trail, the outlaw himself would feel a sudden, inexplicable chill, a sense of fate closing in like a tightening noose. But in that moment, there were only 2 travelers crossing the infinite frontier under the rising sun. A weary hunter of justice and a widow who refused to let her story end in a graveyard. Though they didn't speak the words aloud, both knew the truth that the wind carried that morning. Sometimes, the smallest request for warmth beside a lonely fire can alter the course of a life forever. The journey spanned several grueling weeks, taking them through the harshest terrain the West had to offer. Finally, in a dusty outpost, they received the intelligence they had been seeking. An aging ranch hand, who had seen too much and said too little, whispered that Cole Maddox and his marauders had taken refuge near Red Canyon, hidden deep within a desolate valley. It was a treacherous location, fortified by jagged rock formations and skeletal, lightning-struck trees, a perfect fortress for men who lived outside the law. Daniel knew with a gut-level certainty that this was the end of the 7-year odyssey. Under a moonless sky, Daniel and Emily approached the mouth of the valley with ghostly silence. In the distance, a small, orange spark revealed a campfire. Around it, several silhouettes were visible, engaged in low conversation. One figure stood out, a man whose face was marked by a jagged, pale scar that caught the light like a strike of lightning. It was the man who had torn Emily's life asunder. Emily's hands began to shake, but the tremors weren't born of terror this time. It was the sheer, crushing weight of finally standing face to face with her tormentor. Daniel leaned in close, his voice a mere breath in her ear. "Stay focused, Emily. We didn't come all this way for blood or revenge. We came to write the final sentence of this story." He gave a silent signal. Hidden in the rocks and shadows were the sheriff of the nearest town and a group of local ranchers Daniel had organized according to a meticulous plan. In an instant, the valley was sealed off. When Cole Maddox realized that every exit was blocked by cold steel and grim-faced men, he slowly rose to his feet. For the first time in his violent life, the arrogance that had been his shield vanished, replaced by a sudden, cold realization of his own mortality. Daniel stepped into the light of Maddox's own fire, his voice calm and resonant. "Cole Maddox, I have been trailing you for 7 long years, waiting for your ride to come to an end. Tonight, you've run out of road." Maddox looked around at the rifles aimed at his heart from every direction. Slowly, almost mechanically, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall into the dirt. It was then that Emily stepped forward. Her eyes were brimming with tears, but her stance was unwavering and her voice was clear. "You burned my life to the ground," she said, looking directly at the man with the scar. "You took my husband and thought you could just ride away into the tall grass. I spent every night thinking that when I finally saw you, I would be filled with nothing but a desire for your death." She paused, the silence of the valley absolute. "But standing here now, I realize something. Justice is a much bigger thing than hatred could ever be. Hatred is small. Justice is what we owe to the ones we lost." The valley remained silent as Maddox was taken into custody. For the first time in years, the surrounding territories felt as though they could finally draw a clean breath. A few days later, Daniel and Emily found themselves back at the very spot where their journey had begun. It was the same cluster of trees, the same open field, and a new fire crackling under the vast, quiet sky. As the morning sun began to paint the horizon in shades of gold and pink, Emily sat by the warmth and smiled softly. "If I hadn't found the courage to ask you for a place by your fire that night, I think my life would have stayed in the shadows forever." Daniel looked up at the vast expanse of the morning sky, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "Well, Emily, sometimes fate doesn't bother to announce itself. Sometimes, it just shows up in the form of a simple question." Emily looked at him curiously. "What question?" Daniel watched the rhythmic dance of the flames and replied quietly, "May I warm myself by your fire?" And there they sat, 2 souls no longer lost, watching the sun reclaim the plains. In the immense, unforgiving desert of the frontier, one eternal truth remains: sometimes a small act of human kindness doesn't just provide warmth for a single night. It changes the trajectory of a life forever.